Our series on drugs and drug abuse continues now with a special look at the problem in America's inner cities, where drugs have become a part of everyday life for children as well as adults. Two men with different approaches to the problem of drugs and children are with us. They are Education Secretary William Bennett and Civil Rights and Political Leader Jesse Jackson. We set up their discussion with this report from Oakland, California, by Spencer Michaels of public station KQED San Francisco.
Everyone agrees it's the easy drug money that leads to scenes like this one in Oakland. Police barge into a home and arrest young people in the throes of the illegal drug business. Around the country, especially in poor areas with high unemployment, thousands of teenagers and younger children are so thoroughly involved in using or dealing drugs that an entire generation is in danger.
Okay, so how do you feel about this?
It's a way of life for most people. You know, they grow up selling marijuana and weed and stuff. That's how they make their money.
Nobody wants to work making no minimum wage. That's not any money at all. $3.35 when they can go out there and sell drugs and make fast money.
Make $1,000 a day.
Of course, drugs are everywhere, from suburbia to fashionable city neighborhoods. And it is the widespread use of drugs that has brought the problem to the attention of Nancy Reagan and others. The First Lady has carried her anti-drug crusade around the country and even overseas. Here, she visits a rally in Oakland and joins in a cheer to just say no. Mrs. Reagan's approach is targeted at children, the most vulnerable sector of society.
Someone is going to come up to you and say, come on, this is fun. Everybody does it. But everybody doesn't do it. And it's not fun. And it takes a lot more courage to say no than it does to say yes.
Nancy Reagan's appearances here and at rallies and events like this all across the country have accomplished one thing. They have focused nationwide attention on the problems of drug use and sales. Those problems run deep, perhaps deeper than is evident at rallies like this. Like many urban areas, Oakland's population is heavily minority, 40% black, with 16% of the families living below the poverty level. Nowhere are drugs so pervasive. Nowhere do they determine the quality of life so absolutely as in these poor minority neighborhoods.
I was making enough money to recop and have fun, you know, get high every night and go places and buy little things, you know.
Their whole life, you know, revolved around violence and, you know, selling drugs and making money and stuff, you know.
17-year-old convicted drug dealers serving time talk freely about their lives on the condition they remain anonymous. They can tell you that life on the streets of Oakland or any city can be dangerous.
I think it was possible that I could have got killed, you know, being a mistake for somebody else, or like you were saying about turf wars and stuff like that, you know.
SDU 2 guys, SDU 1 guys, all got your shotguns, right?
What is mainly being done about drugs is vigorous police attacks on street dealing.
All units, go.
They do it full time, trying to find out where drugs are being sold outdoors. The result, according to the cops?
It appears it moved a lot of it inside. It's made them a lot more cautious. You don't see the numbers of kids on the corner selling that you used to see.
I don't care if they take every police officer from every state and country, they will not, you know, they will not stop drugs. I mean, it's part of their everyday life. I mean, it's part of their program in their life. Every day they wake up, I said, well, we're going to go over to her house and get high.
I started smoking weed when I was in the 4th grade. It wasn't no big deal. I just smoked weed every day. You know?
Every day?
And I still smoke weed every day.
On a major thoroughfare in East Oakland, 3 young women, none of them yet graduated from high school, passed the time.
Everybody into cocaine nowadays because there's so many base heads out here.
Ava Washington has lived in East Oakland in a housing project 14 years and worries constantly about her children's safety because of gang warfare.
And I'm not going to lie, it's drugs. It's drug-related, and then again, it's this peer pressure thing. And like, we sitting out here, and they've been coming through here like once a week. And the boys that's playing over there at the basketball court, they'll just start shooting. Don't care who they shooting at. They just begin misfiring.
Yeah, there be a lot of shooting around here. Sometimes it be at nighttime, sometimes be in the daytime when people be playing. But if I hear it, it's right by me. If it's right by me, I'll run. But if it ain't, I just keep playing.
I was scared of dying, right? When you come close to dying, you know, it's even been times that I didn't came that close to death. And laughed about it the same night, a couple hours after it happened, just laughed about it.
Remain seated and come to order. Court's now in session.
In juvenile court, Judge Wilmot Sweeney must decide how to treat young drug dealers. Sweeney presides over an increasing number of cases where teenagers are accused of selling hard drugs. Here, a young man was caught selling cocaine while on probation for a previous drug violation.
I believe that the minor is motivated, and I believe that his stay in custody, some 38 days, has taught him a very, very valuable lesson.
While he was on probation, he may have been completing his weekend training academy, but he was flunking the course out on the street.
Like the prosecutor and the probation officer, Sweeney finds that it's hard to reason with young drug offenders. Nothing seems to impress them other than the threat of jail.
The lack of morality that's displayed by them, and the fact that they don't even see things the way the rest of us see things. That's shocking and it's scary. We've got to do something about it.
My basic concern is this is 2 times in a row and in a very short time. I mean, a very short time. He comes in and there's one drug finding, then he turns around and he does another one. Bam. It's telling the court to go to hell. Probation report indicates that the mother has a cocaine problem herself.
I almost felt like crying. I hope you didn't see that in there. At least I hope he didn't see that. This kid's mother is on cocaine. It's clear that he's using his cocaine sales to help support the family. I've got to consider taking him out of the home and placing him somewhere else.
All right, now, James, I'm ordering you to camp. If you come back with drugs, I got to escalate. That means I got to get tougher.
Tough is one of my A things. I take the view to the kid. You've told everybody to go to hell up to me. If you'd listened to the cop on the beat, you never would have gotten into trouble. If you'd listened to your school teacher, you never would have gotten into trouble. And finally, you're here dealing with me. I am the last step. You will not tell me to go to hell and get away with it. We've got to say that something can be done at this level. And I insist that we try hard to do that.
Educators find that by the time a child reaches high school, it is probably too late to direct him away from a drug life. Oakland is trying to get to younger elementary school children.
Someone came up to me and asked me to sell drugs, but I said no.
Street Smarts, in its first year, is a carefully crafted curriculum designed to teach elementary school children how to deal with crime, drugs, and violence. Toward the end of the instruction block, uniformed police officers run one class.
Do you think that drug sales are going to stop because one person says no?
Nobody knows if this approach keeps kids on the straight and narrow as they enter their teens. What is missing is a full-scale assault that gets at causes, not just symptoms, to change the lives of youngsters caught up in a cycle of drugs and poverty.
Now to a federal official who has been looking for ways to break that cycle and rid the schools of drugs, the Secretary of Education, William Bennett. Mr. Secretary, you want the schools to crack down hard on drug use, correct?
Yes, I do.
What do you want them to do?
Well, I want schools to send, as I want other adults to send, a clear and unambiguous message that says, don't take drugs. If you take drugs, you're going to pay for it. And if you're dealing with drugs, you're really going to pay for it.
How can the schools do that?
Well, schools have done it. At least some schools have done it. Joe Clark, a principal at Eastside High School in Paterson, New Jersey, when he got control of the school, it was called a cauldron of violence and terror. All sorts of drug dealers, all sorts of drug use. Joe Clark got on the loudspeaker of the school and he said, welcome to the new Eastside High School. What was exists no more. There are no more drugs. He suspended 300 students and the drug problem just about disappeared, and he's still got that school under control.
What about the use of police officers and that sort of thing in the school itself?
Entirely appropriate if you've got that serious a problem. Yes, indeed. Joe Clark was not hesitant to use police officers. Other people aren't. I've been traveling around the country, Jim, and talking at schools to students and principals. I've also been meeting with undercover police officers at various schools. And the situation that they describe is one that in some communities there's a little bit too much winking at this problem. A kid who's found dealing is thrown out for a week, and then he's back in and he's a hero. His classmates say, see what he got away with. We had a story here in the Washington Post Saturday where 6 students were arrested, and they were identified because they were wearing $500 or $600 clothes and carrying beepers. The beepers were to interrupt them during class when a deal was about to be made. Now, this is outrageous, and it's gotten to the point that we really have to be very clear and unambiguous about this situation.
And you think that is a function of education to do that?
Well, I think certainly it's a very important educational function to say you will not destroy yourself, and you certainly will not take part in destroying other people's lives. One of the things that I think is particularly worth noting, Jim, is that we're seeing drug use extend further and further down. That is, younger and younger children are using it. A poll points out that our 4th graders, a third of our 4th graders, this was in my weekly reader, a third of our 4th graders said they have been pressured to use alcohol and marijuana. When you get to the 7th grade, 12-year-olds, you're talking about 50% of these kids feeling this kind of pressure. If kids use drugs, particularly drugs like cocaine, they are going to become addicted. When they become addicted, they need money to feed their habit. One of the ways they get the money to feed their habit is to turn other kids on. That's why this thing can grow so insidiously.
What do you say to those who suggest that it's not a school teacher or a school principal's job to play cop, to enforce and to inform?
It's every adult's responsibility to say no about this problem. And one of the things we can't do to kids is have them bounce off one adult what the other adult is saying. For one adult to say, well, that's not my problem, see somebody else. This is a case where adults have to present a united front to children and say, we will not tolerate it. It cannot happen.
What about like kids that we just heard from Oakland who live in a drug-filled environment? What good is it going to do them to go to school and hear a different message?
Well, they'd better hear it somewhere. I mean, I take it they heard from Judge Sweeney, and I think that lady certainly wants to extend that message. Interesting point about Joe Clark. When he suspended 300 kids, first time it had been done, parents called a meeting. Parents of a couple of suspended kids wanted to have a meeting. They came, but so did the rest of the community. And the rest of the community said, just fine, Mr. Clark, you just stay at it. The kids themselves, Jim, are telling us that we're not being strict enough. A Gallup poll, kids identified drugs as their most serious problem, the most serious problem facing them. And 80% of our teenagers said that the laws against use and distribution are not strict enough. That's what the kids are saying.
Well, you've been traveling around the country on this, Mr. Secretary. Where's the problem? Why are schools, administrators, teachers, principals, whatever, why are they not cracking down? Why are they not being tougher?
Well, some are and some aren't. It takes a brave man or a brave woman to step forward and say, look, we have a problem. I talked to some school board members recently, and they said they talked to the public affairs office of the school district, and the public affairs office said we didn't have a problem. Well, you can't stop with the public affairs office. You got to talk to the cops and you got to talk to the kids, and everybody has to admit it. Lots of people don't want to admit that there's a problem in our school or in our community. And I'd say, as Secretary of Education, I would say no principal should be penalized who stands up before his community tomorrow night or next week or in September and says, folks, we have a problem and I need you to get behind me. I didn't start this, but I want to put an end to it.
Thank you.
Thank
Robin?
you.
Another man who's thrown himself personally into the fight against drugs in the schools is the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He's been talking about drug abuse to students around the country as part of his Push for Excellence campaign. Reverend Jackson joins us tonight from public station KPBS in San Diego, where he just finished speaking to students at a local high school. Reverend Jackson, what do you think of Secretary Bennett's proposals?
Well, I think that all people who are interested in saving our children must say no to drugs at various levels. I must say at the outset, I have a sense of pain and humiliation at watching this focus again on black children and drugs. It's just like Bill Moyer's focus on the vanishing black family. When I spoke to Gallaudet School for the Deaf, children from all over the world, more than half came down admitting that they were on some level of drugs. The next day I went to a school in Western Virginia, 90% white and suburban. More than 1,500 came down, and some teachers came down with them. Children in the rural areas who feel that they cannot save their families' farms, using drugs as some form of anesthesia. Just to focus on this as black or in the city does a disservice to the entire dialogue.
Well, This series lasts 2 weeks, Reverend Jackson, and we've made the point repeatedly in the first week, and we'll be making it again, that the drug problem goes through all sections, all conditions, all kinds of Americans, and that was just one example this evening. It wasn't intended to focus on that.
The reason I keep going to these suburban schools, where there are black, white, and brown, so as to put this crisis in a national or in an American perspective. For example,
that's what we're trying to do.
We have the supply side issue of drugs coming across the border. But even bigger than that, we have the demand side problem about children's appetites. They are not being taught morally that drugs are immoral. The drugs are the short step to jail or to early death. We need the Secretary of Education, Mrs. Reagan, the mass media, people who have the most access to our children's minds, to teach them in their formative years about the immorality and danger of drugs. It's just not happening.
Well, do you agree with Secretary Bennett that getting tougher in the schools, he gave the example of the school in New Jersey, is that a good step? Expelling or suspending students who are on drugs, bringing in the police, and so on?
If you use that method, you might have to turn the jails in the schools and the schools in the jails. It's so widespread, there are not enough jails to hold them. At the time when we're cutting back with Graham Ruppman Hollins on teachers and jailers and judges, we have to go to a level deeper than the law. There's not enough room in the jails to hold them. Somehow we must get to the values of our children and their parents that has us now trapped in such a widespread epidemic of drug usage as just a way of life.
How do you do it? Describe your approach when you go to these schools.
First, I ask the children. I just spoke to 2,000 a day. How many of you know someone in your age group who's dead because of drugs? About 1/3 will stand. Or you know someone in your school who is in jail because of drugs? Almost all will stand. Or someone who has taken drugs in your school? Almost all will stand. I then argue that taking drugs is immoral, and that taking drugs will lead them to doing things they did not mean to do, and to early graveyards. And by and large, after I challenge them, I ask those who've tried it, who want to choose another road, to stand and come forward. 3/4 sometimes to every student will come forward. If you're looking at the bad apple theory, you got the basket coming and a few good apples to the left. When our top athletes are selling liquor and drugs as a lifestyle, our culture has now been inundated with this very devastating form of life.
You know, I've read a criticism of your technique that says that because of the strength of your personality, it is very effective in the school while you're there, but gradually after you leave, then things go back to normal again.
Well, what that really suggests is that if I can, with the strength of personality and moral convictions, get these children to move off of dead center, then the Secretary of Education would meet with me and Mrs. Reagan and top artists and athletes and mass media, then maybe all of us together can tilt the situation in another direction. It's not enough to be against it. It's not enough to call on police. We together must have a countercultural movement to take away the style and fashion of drugs. Many children are in drugs, on drug escaping pain. Some are there pursuing pleasure. Many of these farm children, I suggest to you, tell me they're on drugs because they're afraid that by losing the family farm, they feel a sense of guilt and impotence. Many inner city youth, no jobs. Others fear a nuclear disaster. All afraid of the future. So some turn to sex without love, others to drugs, others to nostalgia. We must, as adults, come together and provide for them a future that will make drugs, which is a form of death, less enticing and less profitable.
Reverend Justin, thank you. Jim?
Thank you.
Secretary, what do you think of the Jesse Jackson concept?
Well, I think he's absolutely right that we have to have join with efforts at law enforcement the clear and unambiguous teaching of right and wrong. And many of us have had concern over the 60s and 70s that the unambiguous teaching of right and wrong had thinned out a little bit in some of our schools. So I'm glad to hear him say that.
Are both of you gentlemen suggesting that the public schools of America do not teach the simple fact that taking drugs is wrong?
Oh, well, I am suggesting it unequivocally. As a matter of fact, invariably, as these children come down in great numbers, they often ask, what about the teachers? And when I raise that question, sometimes as high as 35 teachers come forward. We have left the notion
35, wait a minute, 35 teachers come forward that they are taking drugs?
come down and join those children in the line. And teachers who are taking drugs do not have the moral authority to deal with right and wrong. We got to go deeper than legality. We must deal with the immorality. We must kill the appetite for drugs. The border must be our nasals and our tongue.
But I agree with that, but that's a long-term project, and it should start from the cradle and should continue through school. But in some situations, you're facing something like an emergency. And as the judge said, and I thought very well, the only thing that will get some of these kids straight is the threat of jail. And in some situations where you're talking about pushers who are making a lot of money, moral education may be a little late, or they may need to have that moral education in the context of a prison cell.
What about Reverend Jackson's point, though, that there aren't enough jails to hold the number of kids who are taking drugs or selling drugs or even teachers, as he suggested?
There are enough jails to hold the kids who are pushing drugs. Right now, there are enough jails
It's not true. I suggest to you, if you go to a given school, and I've gone by children ages 6 through 18, where 3/4 of them came forward, there's no facility in that county to hold all of those children.
Well, then, see, I think then we ought to build another one, because we still have innocent children who need to be protected. And
well,
again, you may want to decide in this society that at some point you can say to an individual, if you want to go to hell in a handbasket, you're free to do so, but you can't take somebody else with you, and that's what's going on.
In those extreme cases, where we find the children who are very sick and need therapeutic help, they need to go to the hospital. And we can detect a pusher of drugs. That pusher should go to jail. I offer no defense whatsoever for a drug pusher. But I'm submitting to you that the problem is so much broader than the number that can be arrested.
Well, let's take these things one at a time. Let's go to this. Are you saying, Reverend Jackson, that police should not come into schoolrooms, should not say there should not be shakedowns of lockers, should be undercover police work in schools in order to catch the pushers, etc.? Where would you draw the line between enforcement, etc., in the immediate case, as the Secretary would suggest?
There should be no off limits for a drug pusher, because a drug pusher is a killer, and killers should not find sanctuaries in schools. No doubt about that. On the other hand, we seem to underestimate that the demand side for drugs growing out of our values has children trapped by the millions from grade 1 right on through. So we need to use the law where we can. We need to use the hospitals where we can. But it's so much bigger than that. Our approach must be, in my judgment, much broader.
I agree that we have to have a broad approach. In this campaign, we shouldn't refuse any allies. Moral education, the use of the churches. We find that kids who participate in athletic programs tend to have lower incidence of drug use and the like. But I don't think we can really say that getting tough on this problem, that is the use of law enforcement officers, isn't going to diminish the demand until we've tried it. And in many communities, we really haven't tried it. That's what the cops have told me plainly enough.
Well,
in many communities, people
Secretary,
just do not want to admit that there's this kind of problem.
Mr. Secretary, in this drive, since we have a common desire to wipe out drugs, would it be possible for us to meet together to discuss several approaches and maybe go to some schools together? I think the lack of dialogue with the White House and with your office works against all of us. I think we should work together, and so far we're not.
I'd be happy to. I've been visiting schools this year too, Reverend Jackson, and I've been saying in my school visits that I'd be happy to visit a school with you. You bet, anytime.
I look forward to it.
What's been the problem? Has there been a problem? Why have you all not talked about this until tonight on this program, Mr. Secretary?
Well, I don't know. We're both busy people. I've been talking about it, and I think what I've been saying is pretty public. And Reverend Jackson, I've quoted the Reverend Jackson a couple times on the morally evil nature of drugs. So I don't think we're in fundamental disagreement about it. But
I think that on this issue, there is some basic convergence of thought. But I must tell you that there has been a closed-door policy relative to civil rights and human rights leaders the last 6 years.
Well, that's silly.
The Congressional Black Caucus has tried to meet with the president. Charlie Rangel is an authority on it, and of course we cannot meet with the president.
Have you tried to meet with me, Reverend Jackson? Have I not returned your call?
The fact of the matter is, the reason why there has a basic gap is because we're not communicating. But I tell you what, I welcome the opportunity.
Okay, we got a deal.
I think the stakes are so high, If we did it together, it would have a much more public impact.
Mr. Secretary, what about Reverend Jackson's point that in order, if you really want to stop this, it has to be stopped. You can, in the immediate case, okay, in the classrooms, et cetera, law enforcement. But when you have top athletes and you have top people in society endorsing alcohol and being arrested all the time and the free use of drugs, how is that part of your program? Should that be part of the program too, to stop drugs?
Sure. Sure, the authority that comes from movie stars or drugs using movie stars and others using drugs is terrible teaching. It's a very bad example. That's why I think the powerful image of the First Lady out here and all the trips she's made on behalf of this problem has been so effective, and it's been remarkably effective. We're talking to the baseball players. We're talking to the other athletic organizations about enlisting their aid too. We all have to work together on this one. We'll be putting out a little book in 2 or 3 months on what we know about drug use among teenagers and best ways that we have seen to prevent it. But I'll tell you from our research already, there is no substitute for very clearly directed adults saying to children, it doesn't fly here, it just doesn't go here, and being backed up by other adults.
And that if you do it and you get caught, you're going to go to jail.
Yeah, there's a consequence. If you're pushing, you're gone. That's right.
He's not right. Yes, sir.
I'm about to say, for those who are escaping pain, the pain of unemployment and lack of job training, the pain of family farm foreclosures, the pain of the threat of nuclear war. That's one level that we must grapple with. For those who are pursuing pleasure because they've heard it on radio or they've watched it on video, that's another level. And that's why I'm concerned that we rise above lines of race, our politics, and use the artists, use the athletes, use the disc jockeys, all who have a voice that will be heard to take away the fascination with this form of death.
But then let's keep politics out of it, Reverend Jackson, talking about Graham Rudman and farms and so on. Let's go back to where you started. You know as well as I do, because that's where you started, that this problem crosses sex lines, race lines, class lines, community lines. This is a problem throughout society. And I don't think we're going to get very far by suggesting this is, or half of it is due to some kind of governmental policy. That just won't fly.
I submit to you that when I talk with some of the farm children out in Omaha, their sense of impotence, their sense of alienation is that the future is not very bright for them.
Reverend Jackson
and their lives are quite tied up with what they see as their future.
But Reverend
I've
Jackson,
been with these inner city youth who make a buck this way or get high to escape their pain. And we would make a sad mistake to just deal with the fruit of alienation and not deal with the root of this problem.
Well, Mr. Jackson, as a Christian minister, you know that you have to be very careful in indulging people when they want to put responsibility onto somebody else. And if somebody's 16 or 17, 18 years old in possession of their faculties, and they're blaming their addiction to drugs or their use of drugs on somebody else, I hope you're correcting them on the grounds of individual moral responsibility.
We have to leave it there. Reverend Jackson, we're out of time. Reverend Jackson in San Diego, thank you very much. Secretary Bennett here, thank you very much. Robin?
Another highly visible part of the current war on drugs is aimed at keeping young people away from drugs in the first place. To find out how that campaign is working, correspondent John Merrow talked with high school students in Washington, D.C. last week and after President and Mrs. Reagan's television appearance last night.
It's back to school time for America's children, and while drug and alcohol abuse cuts across all generations, it's especially damaging to the young people on whom our future depends. So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us. God bless you, and good night.
Okay, you heard the speech. Now, on the networks, there'll be instant analysis. How about you all provide the analysis?
It was really kind of a joke because both of them, first of all, they were saying basically the same thing over and over again, and they said it was a real personal viewpoint, and it didn't seem personal at all. It sounded like something that had been written.
He kept bringing in the part about like the Second World War. I didn't feel that had anything really to do with the topic on drugs, but he was getting a little patriotic there.
I was pleasantly surprised to find that the stance he was taking was curing abusers and not punishing them, because it's so much more constructive. Because if you punish them, you drive it underground.
They make it sound like everybody's happy and nothing's wrong except drugs, and that's not true, because there's other people use drugs because there's something wrong in their life.
One point that he sort of, he mentioned it, but he didn't sort of dwell on it that long, was the point that you've got to change the public's whole attitude towards the drugs. And I think that's the only way that they're going to stop it. I mean, they suggested spending billions on billions on, stopping it from coming in, but if people still want it, they're going to get it.
Mr. and Mrs. Reagan called for a crusade against drugs. Are you going to sign up?
No. Definitely not.
The high school students we talked to last night and last week in school are just as critical of the Democrats. To the students, the heightened interest in drugs is nothing more than political opportunism.
Now that it's an election year, all these congressmen, all these very conservative congressmen are all up for re-election, and they think, well, let's hit home with the middle class saying we're stopping drugs, and that's why you should re-elect me.
I mean, for me, I think it's a lot politically motivated. But, one way or the other, I really don't mind, because as long as they're willing to fight drugs, I think it's a good cause.
Students agree that fighting drugs is a good cause. They wonder, though, if it's a hopeless one.
You say it was possible to cut off all drug supplies, like all cocaine, all pot, all everything. It wouldn't matter, because they would come up with some synthetic thing in America, which would be easily distributed. They could make something else. It'll always be there.
For these high school students, the key is reducing the demand for drugs, not the supply. In fact, advertising campaigns aimed at reducing the demand have been going on for years.
Cocaine?
No thanks.
Yo, my man, you want some lewds?
No way.
Mostly, I think people my age just sort of look at them and laugh, that's funny or that's not cool or whatever, because I think either the message is geared towards younger people, as he said, or else they're doing a really bad job, because it just doesn't appeal the way they do it.
Well, they say no to drugs, and it doesn't say why you should say no to drugs.
Here, it's a time when you're questioning authority. You're saying, why are they really bad? And if you don't hear, if you're not told they're bad of you because of this and this, probably by the end of your high school career, you might start experimenting drugs, even though all your life you've been told not to use them.
Things that gets on my nerves, or that I don't really like about all the drug campaigns, is, they all have these just say no, or even the ones that are geared for higher students, they never, seem to want to accept the fact that drugs, at least in the short run, will make you feel good, will make you produce more. Amphetamines can make you stay up all night. You'll get an A on the test the next day. Same thing with cocaine. Marijuana will make you feel real good. You'll feel bad in the long run, but in the short run, it's very good. The trick is to saying, look, we know that you're probably going to experiment with drugs. We know you're probably going to like it, but the fact is, in the long run, it's going to really hurt you.
Tell you what, all right, here's your chance. Go ahead, you create an anti-drug commercial.
They need to show shots of people being, like they say, physically restrained after using PCP. They need to show the people with the burnt-out noses and no mind from cocaine. They need to show drug busts. I've walked by a drug bust, and it's very scary, even though you're not part of it. They need to show that it's not all glamour and Miami Vice and everything.
Violence, nothing but violence. Nothing but, I wouldn't show anything but scenes and of people who couldn't be restrained, or maybe it's showing a drug bust, because that's what it takes. Because that's all I could say. Not even words, just people out of their mind. Maybe it's someone in a casket or whatever. It's not what you want to think about it, but it's all it's the only thing that can be done.
It's not enough to just say no. These young people want to know why they should say no to drugs, and they want to see what could happen if they say yes.